8 ups. I think looks number 7 is next. Hey, look at that. It's a name we don't see too often around here. Zechariah Tiemens says, how can we explain to our moderate left-wing friends that rather than being a rogue faction that has hijacked progressivism, social justice warriors are in fact the product of leftist philosophy? Well, I don't think they're going to take too much convincing, Zechariah, because the social justice warriors are the children of moderate leftists. And of all the things that are going on out there, the thing that I enjoy the most, because I think they're horrible people with a horrible philosophy, I really kind of enjoy watching them eat each other. That's the way communism always works and socialism always works, right? I mean, the first thing that you do when you have a revolution is to say, we're going to take power in the name of the people. And then everybody celebrates the power of the people. And then the other people who also helped you take power from the people are killed. Till finally it's just you. So it's fun to watch them eat themselves. And what I mean by that is you'll have a woman who's a 50-year feminist, let's say. She's been writing feminist screeds since Maud was on the air, doing it since 1971, and she's a known feminist author. And she'll get up and speak about feminism, in a radical feminism, to a group of young, liberal, progressive people. And she will stand there and expect to get the praise and the glory, and people will say Hosanna and wave palm fronds at her. But what, in fact, she gets is hatred and contempt. Because how can she possibly know about feminism if she's a white woman? What can she know about feminism? What is that? It's not transactional. Intersectional feminism? How can she possibly know about that? She not only does not get praise, she gets ridicule and scorn and hate. It's awesome. I love it. Because when your only philosophy in life is to find out who's the biggest victim, sooner it's like Highlander, right? There can be only one. There can only be one top victim. Ultimately, these gladiators and people are trying to praise themselves higher and higher and higher on their own moral hierarchy of who's the most victimized. It's like pretty soon it's like Highlander. There's only one end immortal. There's only one, and they'll fight until there's only one left, and then finally there'll be one person left on the left, and that will be the single greatest victim in the country. And they have their own standards and they keep their own score and all the rest of it. Anybody who has less victimhood than that person loses. So the moderates are the people who sent their kids to be taught by radicals, thinking that, oh well, good, leftism, that's good. I'm a leftist. Let's give them nothing but leftism. Let's get religion and reason and all these other conservative things out of the picture, and then they'll be perfect little kids. If we can just get all these horrible conservative things out of the world, like playing with guns, let's say, or allowing girls to play with dolls when in point of fact they should be playing with slide rules because more women should be engineers and all the rest of this nonsense. So they decided let's raise kids by liberals. We're liberals. Let's get other liberals to raise our liberal kids, and we'll make them more liberal than we are. And then once they have all the liberal values in them, we'll have a perfect society. And it ain't working out that way. As a matter of fact, these are the most violent, hate-filled, vicious swine that we've ever had in this country. These Antifa lunatics. We did a story on the NRA segment this morning about this guy. What was his name? It's on my Facebook page here. It's a professor who basically said, this is an interesting story. His name is Lars Meshack from Cal State Imagine, California. I was shocked. So shocked. Fresno. He tweeted, "To save American democracy, Trump must hang. The sooner the higher, the better." And his hashtags are the resistance and death of fascism. And he talks about how that they should shoot 2 Republicans in the back of the head for every immigrant that's forced to leave the country. And all of these other things. And he says, how can you have justice in a society like America when all there is racism and capitalism? Now, I'm looking at the picture here of Lars. And I have to drag this in. It's worth it. Let me just see if I will take whatever time it takes, because I just had an interesting thought about Lars, our friend Lars, because I think I got Lars figured out. Okay, I'm doing a screen grab, and now I have to find it, and then I will put it into, there he is, then I will put it into the incredibly forgiving Ustream software, and I'm going to hook up the mic because I want to talk about Lars, and I want to use his picture while I'm talking. Change audio, yeah. Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah, this is obviously a big blown up thing, but here's Lars. Here's the guy who says that Trump must hang. Here's the guy that says that Republicans must be killed. Here's the guy that says death to fascism, take all the fascists and kill them all. Here he is. Now, how much imagination do you think it takes to take this guy out of his 100% cotton shirt and put him into a black outfit with a black peak cap that has a chrome death set on the front of it? If I have ever seen a human being in America in 2017 who looks more like an SS officer than Lars, I simply haven't met anybody who looks more like an SS officer. Look at the look in this guy's eyes. Look at the look in his eyes. It's not the look of intelligence. It's not the look of a freedom fighter. It's not the look of somebody who's passionate or compassionate for the poor. That is the look of a killer. That's a killer's look. And he's using killer language because he's a killer. That's what he is. He is a predator. He is a predator. Now, you might ask yourself, well, wait a minute, hold on. This doesn't make any sense. He's talking about how evil white people are, but he's white himself. Yes, that's right. He is being fascistic about the only thing that he's allowed to be a fascist about in America, and that's killing fascists. It's just so obvious to me. So I did a little looking on old Lars here, and I looked up his book, and I think he wrote a book and it was on German mercantile sea transport in the 18th century, talking about how a group of German merchants from what was it? Some German duchy, started a capitalist link with America. And I gave it 1 star, by the way, because I don't think that potential murderers should get money from Amazon. So what is it? What's going on here, Lars? Lars is using his inborn, natural, killer, fascist, murdering instincts, and he's channeling them in the only place that he can, which is towards conservatives. The only people, this is our white privilege, right? The only people that he's allowed to talk about openly killing, in his circle anyway, is white males, Republicans, conservatives. They're the only people that you can actually talk about killing. So he's a fascist because he's talking about murdering people who he disagrees with. He's talking about hanging and murdering people he disagrees with politically. He is the essence of the popular understanding of fascism. The technical definition is even a little more interesting, but he is, by every definition, a fascist. And he looks like a fascist. And if he'd been alive 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, that face, let's bring it up again, why don't we? Because it's a very, very interesting face. If this face here had been born in Germany in the 1920s, this guy would be an SS officer. If he'd been born in Russia in the 1910s or 20s, he'd be a Chekist. He'd be a member of the MKGB, or he'd be a member of the OK. This is the guy who shows up at an apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning in a black car, takes a creaky elevator up to the 13th floor, bangs on the door, and takes an entire family out of there, puts them in the black car, takes them to the Lubyanka, and shoots them in the back of the head after they beat them to death. Nearly to death. That's what this guy is. And he's always been that way. And he's wired that way. You just look at him. It's not hard to figure out. That look is a look. That's not the look of a peaceful person. That's the look of a fascist. And so he's got these fascistic tendencies. He wants to beat people up. He wants to shoot people. He wants to kill people. And where does he put that? He can't be a Nazi. He'd be a fine Nazi, but he can't be a Nazi in America today because he wouldn't get any traction. He'd be ostracized because this is, in fact, not a racist country. And it is, in fact, not a fascist country, because if this fascist had actually dressed up like a fascist and shown sympathy for fascism, like dressing like a Nazi, he would have not only not had any friends or a job, he'd be absolutely, absolutely ostracized, which is what happens in this decent country to actual fascists, you see? So there is one group of people he is allowed to talk about killing, and that's us. And so that's what he does. And I'm not worried about this guy, because unlike his, I'm not going to say his grandfather, it's not fair to slander grandchildren of people that do evil things, and perhaps his grandfather, in fact, likely his grandfather didn't do anything particularly evil or bad, but he is a living contradiction, and he is trying, among many other things that he's trying to do. In fact, this is a big motivator, so I'm 100% convinced of this, folks. Why does this white German guy named Lars talks so much about fighting racism and fascism. Why? Because he knows that he is in the group of people that are fascists and racists, according to him. So he has to be extra special, double anti-fascist, because his name is Lars and he's a white male. He doesn't want to be a white male. What he wants to be is a black female. He wants to be a black female lesbian, because then, if he was, then he'd have the moral authority to do the murdering that he wants to, and he'd have the moral authority to attack the people that he sees in the mirror, and he'd be able to do it without contradiction, without driving himself batty. He doesn't want to be a white male. It's kind of fun. Maybe we should end here because we started on white privilege. Let's go to him one more time. Lars, who talks about the evils of capitalism, is a professor at a university. You can only imagine my surprise that that's a professor at a university. His book is about 18th century German merchant sailors and their connection between Germany and America. Now, that might be a perfectly interesting field, but I suspect that if it was, I would have heard of it already. So you've got this guy who is good at one thing. He knows a great deal about 18th century German ocean-borne trade. But unfortunately, that's not a well-paying job, and I think probably much more likely it doesn't get the girls in the sack or the boys, whatever the case may be. And so he's quite angry about all this. And he's quite angry that a person who knows so much about 18th century German mercantile relationships across the Atlantic Ocean through sea trade, he's quite upset that somebody with that degree of knowledge is not more successful than he is. He's a professor at Fresno, at Cal State Fresno. He's a professor at a state school in Fresno. I don't know if you've ever been to Fresno. There's some lovely people in Fresno, but Fresno is not the Riviera, and Fresno is not Harvard. So here's this angry guy who knows a little bit about something, who has a book out there, which I'll bet he sold 6 copies of, to other people like him. And he's wondering why he's not popular. No, it's not popular because he's an angry, violent loser. That's why he's angry. And he's wondering why people like Donald Trump get elected president of the United States, and he's a professor at Cal State Fresno. Yeah, T-Dog Lies brings it up. I was going to mention it. Churchill said that the fascists of the future will call themselves anti-fascists. Because you have to understand something. Fascism exists only when you have an enemy. You cannot have fascism without an enemy. For the Nazis, the enemies were the Jews. The Soviets said we are fighting fascism, but this definition of fascism, controlling people's thoughts and killing people who disagree with you, they were better at it. They were better fascists than the fascists were. The Soviets felt the same thing. The enemy is the class. It doesn't matter whether he's a good person. If he's from the bourgeoisie, he needs to be killed. And if this person's a mass murderer, but he's a proletarian, fine. Put him to work in the gulag, intimidating the musicians and the scientists that they have there, working in coal mines. So, in Germany, if you wanted to beat people up, what did you do? Well, if you wanted to beat people up in Germany, a certain time in Germany, you figured, well, who can I beat up and get away with it? The Jews. Let's beat up the Jews. Yeah, nobody likes the Jews. I know. I'll hang out with the Nazis, and I'll get to beat up people, which gets that out of my system, and I get to take their stuff too, by the way. You know, the complicity is something, I forget what the number is, 7% maybe of the German population were members of the Nazi Party, which means that most of them weren't ideological, fellow travelers. But one of the things that happened with the Nazis, and the exact same thing happened with the communists as well, and this is where the regular common people become complicit in the crime. Regular Russian people and regular German people were not members of the SS. They were not Nazis. They were not any of those things. And they told themselves that they don't know what's going on, and they told themselves that family's being evicted, but they're probably just being put on a train someplace and being sent to someplace like maybe Madagascar, as if that was okay, you know. Well, it's not like they're going to kill them or anything. They're just taking the Jews out and they're just moving them someplace else, as if that's okay. But where they become complicit in the crime is when a Jewish family is evacuated from Munich. And they've worked very hard, and now they've got a nice apartment. Well, once those people are picked up and shipped out, guess what happens to that apartment? It's available. And guess what happens to all the furniture in that apartment? Because these people can only take a small bundle of things which are going to be stolen from them again anyway, along with their teeth and their hair. So what happens to that stuff? Well, it goes to somebody, right? How many German families moved into Jewish apartments and knew that at the very least, the people that used to live in this place were taken away for no reason other than they had a different religion? How many of the people in the house on the embankment, which is one of the Seven Sisters of Stalin's big buildings, it's a giant apartment complex on the bank of the river in Moscow. And this is where most of the Communist Party nomenclatura lived. How many of those people lived in fear every single night and waited for the Black Maria, the black limousine, for the checkup, under whatever particular name they were going with at that particular time? And how many of them sat there in their beds terrified and listened to that elevator and prayed and prayed and prayed and finally were only able to breathe when that elevator had passed their floor and kept going, which meant that they were safe for tonight. Somebody else is going to be murdered, but not them, not tonight. And then when those families been evicted and that person's been taken out and shot, that apartment is open and they move into it. And that's where the complicity is, in my opinion. That's where it is. They didn't ask any questions about where the original owners of that apartment went. Part of that was because they were terrified, and that's certainly true. And part of it is because they wanted the nicer apartment. The entire Soviet system, secret police system, the Great Terror especially, it worked on denouncements. That's all it did. If you were suspected, you didn't have to do anything, by the way. This is the most important thing to understand about how the Soviets worked. You didn't have to be guilty of crimes against Soviet power. You only had to be a little bit more likely to commit a crime in the future than somebody else. And what I mean by a little more likely, if you had an aunt living in Belgium, let's say, that'd probably be enough to get you shot, because she's a relative and she's lived in the West, and it's possible that you might communicate, and some of these Western ideas about freedom and so on might be transmitted to you. And you might transmit it to somebody else, and then we'd all be in a heck of a lot of trouble, wouldn't we, here in the Kremlin? So off you go. And so it's all based on denouncements. And so when they would take somebody to the Lubyanka, the first thing they'd do is torture them. And there were millions of people with integrity, millions and millions of Russians with actual genuine integrity who were taken away and told to denounce people, and they wouldn't do it. They ended up doing it, but they ended up doing it because they'd been tortured, beaten to death in many cases. People had their eyeballs knocked out of their heads, that kind of thing. So very few people went in there and just started denouncing people. Most of them fought. Most of them decided, no, I'm not going to turn in my friends. My friends didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. But once you're beaten regularly, long enough, you'll sign anything. Is it Tukhachevsky? That sounds right. I always like to know these things when I'm going to go out. Hang on a second. Let's have a look and see if this is who I think it is. Yes, perfect. Got it right on the first pass. The Russian people, prior to World War II, had one actual genuine military genius, and his name was Mikhail Tukhachevsky, or Tukhachevsky. She knows how to pronounce it. I was going to struggle through. He was the only person in the entire Red Army who understood that war had changed to the degree that Germans like Guderian and all the rest of them knew it. And he was a former Tsarist officer, I believe. And so, needless to say, by the way, the real reason he was killed, and a lot of reasons he was killed, but he was fighting against the Poles in the Civil War. And he was very successful, and Stalin was fighting against them as well, and Stalin was a catastrophe. So even in the 20s, he was somebody who did well while you did badly, so that means you're going to have to be killed someday. So anyway, here's Tukhachevsky. So he's an actual military genius, and he's taken out and he's shot in 1937. And the reason I bring his name up is because in order to justify this, every single person who was shot had to have signed a confession. And if there was any doubt about whether or not they were guilty, they would simply show each other the confession. And one person said, well, he was tortured. And then the guy would say, well, he signed every page. Of course he's guilty. He wouldn't have signed if he wasn't guilty. But so it's the little things in history, you know. It's the little tiny details that really just get you to the heart of the matter. So every single person who was shot in the Lubyanka had signed a confession of one kind or another. And Tukhachevsky's confession was covered with small little brown dots, which we later figured out was the spray of his own blood. So he's being beaten so badly in the Lubyanka. He's being beaten so badly that the blood is spraying across the room and landing on the document. Yeah, blood splatter. David Wellman is a blood splatter analysis is a science all to itself. But Tukhachevsky's confession, for which he was later shot, is covered in his own blood because of the torturing that was done in order to get him to confess. So, I just don't know. Having looked at it quite a bit, I just don't think it's a very good system. And I think we'd be better off if we left it alone. And I'm looking at a picture of this guy. You know, a guy like Tukhachevsky, I don't want to say he's one of the greatest geniuses of all time, although I have to say that the Tsarist General Suvorov, Russian General Suvorov, apparently is the only general in history who never lost a battle. He fought 20 battles and he won all of them, which, by the way, Carl Sagan used this, because Carl Sagan's always down on the military or something. But Sagan also liked good arguments. Apparently a true story. There was some scientist or something, I think he might have been working on the atomic bomb project, or it was afterwards. In any event, it was a scientist, and it was in America. And somebody said, we're going to introduce you to this general and treat him with respect because he's a great general. And the scientist said, well, how do you know he's a great general? And the aide said, well, because he's won 5 battles. And then the guy in his head did the math, and he said, well, let's see, if you win half your battles, 50%, and 25%, 12.5%, basically said, so this guy's got a 6% chance, or 12%, something like that, right? Just randomly of winning 6 battles. He said, show me a general who won 10 battles, and that's just kind of a little interesting thing as far as statistics goes. But 20 battles, Suvorov won them all, and that's pretty remarkable. In any event, the Russians are invaded by the Germans. And one of the reasons that it was such a catastrophe for the Russians was because every single officer that they had that had any kind of sense had been taken out and shot in the purge of the Red Army in the late 30s. And I mean, the numbers are something like 22 out of 23 marshals, or 19 out of 23 marshals, 370 out of 408 generals. I mean, just massacred them all. And because they were a threat to Stalin. And then when the Germans came, there wasn't anybody who knew what they were doing, and they had to learn on the job, which cost them 20 million people, and probably another 20 million civilians. If Tukhachevsky had been, I always wonder what would happen sometimes in history, if Tukhachevsky had just been alive, because when the Germans invaded, by the way, in 1941, when the Germans invaded Russia, all of these officers like Tukhachevsky, who happened to still be alive, not wasn't many of them, were immediately brought out of either the Lubyanka or the gulags and given a brand new uniform, a shave, and a haircut, and sent out to fight the Germans. And it makes me wonder how the Russians would have done if they'd had professional soldiers on June 22nd, 1941. It makes me wonder. Of course, if you've got a dictator, it doesn't matter if they're professional soldiers or not. They're not going to get their way. But you get the idea, right? I mean, if that had been, if the Kerensky government had survived, and you had kind of like a Weimar kind of even if it was an unstable republic, but a republic, and you hadn't killed all of your officers, I wonder how the Russians would have done against the Germans in 1941. And I don't think they would have had to pay the price that they ended up paying for this. They didn't know. By the way, Victor Davis Hanson, the more I read of him, the better, the more amazed I am. He was talking about criticism of Iraq and, the revolt of the generals, and he just went through history and all the different cases where officers had been cashiered or changed or so on. And he made a point that's not so hard to figure out. It's pretty obvious, really. But basically what happens is the people who are good peacetime generals, generally speaking, are bad wartime generals, and vice versa. And that's not so hard to figure out. A wartime general is somebody who cuts to the chase, is somebody who does not get bogged down with niceties about language or discussion, is a natural predators. And in a good way. They are good at fighting and killing people. And those people don't get promoted in peacetime. The people who get promoted in peacetime are the people who've got very smooth language, and they're constantly kissing butt, and they're calling to congratulate the wife of the senator on her birthday and asking how the kids are doing. Those are the guys who get promoted to general in peacetime. But when those guys have to start commanding armies during wartime, they're not very good at it. And likewise, the brutes, the uncouth, shabby men like U.S. Grant and Sherman and loudmouth, arrogant bastards like Patton and MacArthur, these guys, they have to emerge from war. It takes years of mistakes and errors and people dying, your own soldiers dying because of the terrible, terrible decisions made by bad peacetime generals, until finally the wartime generals make themselves known because they're competent at a lower level. They're just doing a good job. And then finally, after 3 years or whatever of these millions of people killed because of your incompetent peacetime generals, then you realize this guy's a fighting general, and next thing you know, U.S. Grant has command of the Army of the Potomac, and in fact of the entire Union. William Tecumseh Sherman, the first modern general, an actual genuine genius who figured out, unlike Grant, we don't have to assault Cold Harbor trenches and lose 7,000 men in a morning, in a couple of hours. We're just going to keep moving around them. They can't stop us, so they're going to constantly set up trying to fight us. We're not going to fight them. We're just going to walk around them. And Sherman did the Western campaign of the 10th of the casualties or something like that Grant had back in the East. And Patton, who's a loudmouth, who designed his own uniforms, who basically sat down and sketched on a piece of paper his uniform, which included, the jodhpurs and the riding crop and a chrome helmet. He designs that uniform and he makes it on his own, and he's a kind of arrogant, nasty, mean-spirited, rotten bastard who's just exactly the guy you want to take an entire army through Germany in 2-3 weeks. Patton would have had Berlin 5 months before the Soviets got there if he hadn't run out of gasoline. He just moved too fast. He was too successful. My favorite story about Patton, I mentioned it a few times on the show. I don't remember the exact numbers. I need to look it up because I tell this story every now and then. But Patton is racing Third Army through the bottom of Germany. He's just moving fast. They don't know where he is. He's moving so fast. And so Eisenhower, in chief in Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force Allied Headquarters, Eisenhower says, "George, I want updates from you. I need to know where you are at any given time." Patton says, "Okay." So Patton sends a radio message to Eisenhower's headquarters and says, "I need to take the town of," and I don't remember the name of the town, so please forgive me because some of you do, but let's just say, for the sake of the argument, it was Bremen, just because it's a German name that I know. It wasn't Bremen, but let's say it was. And I don't remember the numbers either, but you get the idea. So Patton sends a radio message to Ike saying, "Hey, I'm at Bremen. I can take Bremen. I'm going to take Bremen, and then I'm going to move on." And Ike wires him back and says, "George, you can't take Bremen. It's going to take 5 divisions to take Bremen, and you can't do it. So stop." And then a couple hours later, Patton wires him back and says, "Well, I took Bremen with 1 division. Do you want me to give it back to him?" That's the kind of guy that wins wars out there. And LeMay and all the rest of these guys who, unpleasant people. Anyway, that's that. I think that'll probably do it. Yeah, definitely do it. Okay, well, we're off again to another frustrating start because equipment doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I don't know what to say. Working all day, working last week. Just, nope, doesn't work. In any event, I think that'll do it. What's this, 152, 153? Somebody will tell me. I think it's 152. I'll figure it out. So time for me to go. Now it's time to say goodbye to all our company. MIC. See you real soon. KEY. Why? Because we like you. MOUSE. You guys be careful out there now. And thanks for joining us, and especially to our Stratosphere Loungers, our little family of awesome friends. Thanks again for all the support. Thanks again for the support of the members. Hope you guys like the new interview show. And unless something is going on that I don't know of, we will be 152. Thank you very much, AesopsRetreat. We'll be back with 153 next Wednesday. All right. Everybody take care now. We'll see you. Bye-bye.